beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. And today we have a very special guest, Jay Dyer. He is an author and he's written a very interesting book, which I'm sure you're going to want to check out after you hear much of what he has to say. It's called Esoterical Hollywood, Sex Cults and Symbols in Film. And, just a little plug, by the way, check out my new sci-fi book, The Destiny of Our Past, if you feel so inclined. So anyway, Jay, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. I'm glad to be here.
I've been listening to a lot of interviews that you've had, and one of the things that there's a whole bunch of things that just jumped out, but one of the things that I liked in particular was how you said that our modern media, movies, Hollywood, is like a new religion, and our theaters are like the new cathedrals. Could you go into that and just kind of get things rolling?
Yeah, I think that if we look at a book like Hollywood Babylon, which is kind of the famous fringy book that Kenneth Anger wrote, he wrote it about the 30s, 40s, 50s era Hollywood scandals and sex stories, and he appropriately titled it Babylon. And so what I thought was that there ought to be a more updated version of that book, but one that didn't so much focus on sex scandals, but rather on the mythology or the mysteries or the propaganda, et cetera, that we get in our big movies and blockbusters and TV shows and even in documentaries at times. So what I did in the book was basically take that kind of a religious/philosophical perspective and look at all the films that in this version, there'll probably be some sequels, I'm hoping, but at least in the first installment, the ones that stuck out to me from maybe the big directors that everybody knows about, like Spielberg and Kubrick and David Lynch and guys like that, Hitchcock. And I picked out the best essays that I'd done, and because I've been doing this for a good while now, and kind of built up a little bit of an audience and some traffic to the website, and thought, this could be a good book here if you figured out a way to stick them all together. And I thought, why not stick them all together around this idea of the esoteric in general, because it's kind of a generic idea. It could include all kinds of various mysterious topics, from espionage to religious cults and so forth. So that's what I did, and I called it the Occult Empire, and I kind of used the imagery and ideology not just from Kenneth Anger's book, but some of the stuff that David Lynch had written David Lynch had done in his movies. And I picked out films that at the beginning I thought were revelatory in terms of their pretty heavy occultic type presentations, like Lost Highway or Eyes Wide Shut. And I think when you look at Hollywood that way, we can see it as kind of the new religion, the new chapels. If you lived in medieval Europe, you would go anywhere in a village or town and you would see a church or chapel or so forth. And now we go anywhere in a city and we see movie theaters. I guess movie theaters are kind of dying out now given the streaming service of Netflix and all that, but for all intents and purposes, it's still the same notion of, as you said, a kind of like chapels, and we are given our new mythology from on high, from Olympus, right? The gods speak to us from their Hollywood studios, and they give us new myths and new stories that are supposed to give us meaning and, get us behind this or that war effort or so forth and so on. And a lot of people tend to think of Hollywood as something maybe, quote, liberal, which maybe in a social sense, it's liberal. But for a long, long time, there's been a very close connection between the Pentagon and the military and various government agencies in Hollywood, and they're almost always putting out pro-war films. even at times when there's a film that's critical of the war effort, you can usually find numerous films around that same time period that are pro-war, unless it's maybe during Vietnam or something. There's maybe not a whole lot of pro-Vietnam films, but even after the period of the warfare, you'll get these, hero tales that still kind of prop up the narrative of, well, we're the good guys, we're still Americans, and there's only a few exceptions to that, like Full Metal Jacket is not really a hero tale. It's kind of a dark portrayal of the realities of Vietnam. But anyway, so that's what I did in the book, was I just kind of collected together the essays and kind of grouped in under the idea of a cultic empire like Babylon, but it's an updated version of Babylon, and it doesn't focus on sex scandals like Kenneth Anger's book. It focuses on film symbolism.
Yeah, I've often thought that, when you hear students get out of high school, especially, they say that they never really learned anything that really was applicable in their real life. But there was one class I did take in high school, and then later I continued it in college, so I didn't have to take literature. I took film literature and analysis. And it's so amazing that any director, they put stuff into film. There's symbolism. It's part of the creative process. It can also be part of the manipulation process. But most people, I think, are kind of blissfully unaware of how they are just pulled along.
Yeah, I did the same thing. I took film symbolism classes and literary classes and film and lit classes when I was in college. And, I'd always found film fascinating and symbolism in film fascinating, even in high school, and I didn't really know what was going on. And then, as you get deeper into that topic, it is really fascinating. And if you watch enough DVD commentaries and enough interviews with directors, then yes, you know they are absolutely putting symbolic imagery into the films. It's no different than novels. People who write novels, Flannery O'Connor, or whoever, or, James Joyce, they're putting symbolism in their novels. It's pretty obvious. Nobody who has any knowledge of literature would doubt that. And it's no different with directors and screenwriters. Are doing the exact same thing, and people who do art direction and set direction and all this kind of stuff. So cinematography, and that's really, I think, what I was trying to do, was decode a lot of that. And that's I always get asked about the directors, like, well, what do you think Kubrick was really up to? And I don't really know. I mean, my focus was on the films. It wasn't about Kubrick's personal life. It's not about Spielberg's personal life. My focus is on what I think they're trying to say in the movies that they put out. And sometimes it does relate to the question of what was going on in their personal lives, like Alfred Hitchcock did for a time, for example, worked for the British Ministry of Information, filming propaganda. So that's a relevant data point, for my analysis of Hitchcock films. But you could write whole books, the whole movies have been made just on the life of Hitchcock. Him and Anthony Hopkins recently portrayed him with Helen Mirren, just on about him. So, but that's not really what I go into. But as I said, like the first, couple chapters is just Hollywood Babylon and how Hollywood seems to promote a lot of occultism. And, you could read that in various ways. You could say, oh, well, and I discuss these different possibilities. You could say, well, Hollywood is just a means of propaganda. It's just a social engineering tool. It's just, a lot of weird California freaks who are into cults and weird religions and all that, and Kabbalah and that kind of stuff, which all of that's true, and there's all kinds of different, angles you could take it. But I kind of see it in a lot of ways like Wizard of Oz. Like Wizard of Oz is this dude behind this big screen, and he's manipulating, people into thinking that he has all this power. Dorothy and Toto, I guess, but it's all kind of like tricks. It's like a big deception. It's psyops, basically.
Well, I think
that's why.
Well, I just think
that's why I think the connection between the military and the Pentagon and the CIA and these kinds of entities with Hollywood is a lot deeper than most people tend to think. And if you'd have told me that 10 years ago, I would have thought that was crazy. But having looked at this topic a lot more in depth over the last decade, it's even deeper than I ever would have imagined. The relationship between the two.
Well, you can go to the CIA website and look up in Google. Just Google CIA Entertainment Liaison, and it says, "Hey, are you an author or a screenplay writer or something like that?" They'll help you out, or they'll give you direction. It seems that seems to be what's implied, and I've read that a lot of the science fiction and war films. Which most science fiction is actually a war film in and of itself, the Pentagon assists and therefore helps them out. Then they give, they can have influence on the storyline, and then in return, the Pentagon gives them all of this free access to, jet fighters flying, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's all true. And I remember when I first learned that, I was kind of, surprised that it was that close a relationship. But I think it goes a lot deeper because, as you've come to find out, a lot of these A-list stars, a lot of these people can be recruited into working for intelligence. And it's not that they're necessarily going and killing people or beheading some head of state somewhere or something like that. It's more so that they're recruited for the purpose of either blackmail or just, spying on someone. Mm-hmm. And this goes all the way back to World War II with people like Errol Flynn and Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart, all who reportedly had some role in spying. So if you go back to the period of the Hollywood 10 and the suspicions of there being all these communists in Hollywood, one of whom, by the way, would have been Kubrick, who made Spartacus, which is the story of the slave revolt, right? Which is, this is a quote illuminist story. There would be a lot of people would have been recruited to, supposedly help America stop all the commies that were in Hollywood, and so Jimmy Stewart was reported to be one of these guys who was spying for the FBI to look out for subversives in Hollywood. And Cary Grant was supposedly doing this during World War II, and he supposedly ratted on Errol Flynn being a Nazi spy and all this kind of stuff. So you see this pretty frequently going all the way back to the history of theater, probably because people who can lie in an acting role. They might make a good spy. Yeah. So you tend to see this pattern pop up. Natalie Portman's grandmother, I believe, was an MI5 asset. I've mentioned many of these cases in the book where Jennifer Garner, she leaves Alias and she goes to work with the CIA openly. Angelina Jolie is trained by Melissa Mela, who's a CIA operative, and so then Angelina Jolie joins the CFR, and George Clooney is part of the CFR, and you just find this pattern continually popping up, and I think it just kind of suggests that a lot of this is military and intelligence run.
And people can find that in the references in your book, right?
Yes, all those examples I think are referenced in the book, and I have 404 footnotes, so it's not just me speculating. But you could Google all that stuff too, and it would come right up.
One thing you mentioned the war and so forth. I don't want to leave the Pentagon just yet because it's becoming really apparent that the U.S. economy has been in a wartime mode ever since 1945. And therefore it seems that if you have to justify war, you have to justify fear. And a lot of our movies, I mean, I remember as a kid, thinking, why are all the movies trying to make you scared all the time? And is this like part of it, or is it just kind of a literary device to put you on edge and then release it?
No, fear is one of the key usages of propaganda. I mean, that's kind of, that goes back to the images of like the nuke blast and this kind of stuff, which were filmed at Laurel Canyon Studios, which Dave McGowan kind of honed into and exposed in his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And my book is kind of, a lot of people compare it to Dave's book as well, that it's in the same vein as his book. And Laurel Canyon was this, hidden secret Air Force movie studio up in the hills. You have to drive up Mulholland Drive up to Wonderland Avenue, and then there's this old facility up there that's now a house where Jared Leto lives, the actor. It's converted into a residence, but there's still the sort of the remnants of this giant Air Force facility there, and they made movies there. So they were churning out the propaganda films, pretty consistently there. And one of the things that propaganda needs to do to be effective is to mobilize the audience to take action in some form or fashion. That doesn't have to mean that you join the war effort per se, although a lot of propaganda is recruitment. We think back to a lot of 80s movies I've mentioned many times. A lot of those were intentionally recruitment propaganda, especially during the Reagan era, when Reagan, if I recall, allocated a lot of money to Hollywood for recruitment films, and this is where you get things like Top Gun and Navy SEALs and Iron Eagle and Little Nikita, and every one of those films, by the way, which actually promotes one branch of the military. Right? So you've got the Navy with Top Gun and Navy SEALs, and you've got Iron Eagle's Air Force, Little Nikita's Air Force. Many more could be mentioned. There's all kinds of propaganda films like that, but that would include, yes, the notion of fear, and so the idea of the external threat. And one of the chapters in the book, I discussed the old Princeton project that involved the usage of Hadley Cantrell studying the Orson Welles War of the Worlds broadcast. So we all know that story of like Orson Welles doing H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds over the radio, and it scared all these people, and it was studied for its multiple purposes. For one, obviously, it caused fear and panic, but it was also a good advertising tool. It was also a good psychological warfare tool. So this was all put into research, and from a scientific standpoint, psychological standpoint, was studied. And so you can even look at a lot of those alien movies that really started just going wild in the 40s and 50s everywhere. All of that's really part and parcel of the notion of propaganda and the fear of the external threat. There's I'm not saying alien in terms of like space beings, but I'm saying the alien threat of the commies, the alien threat of the fascists, the alien threat. They're all going to come get us, right? They're coming to get us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's transitioned quite clearly in our day, right? It went from the alien threats of that time to the Cold War to now in our day, it's just simply transitioned into the war on terror. This is they're all coming to get us. What happened to all those commies? Like, did they just disappear and convert overnight? Right? I mean, there was like all of these godless commies everywhere, even into the 80s. I was a kid in the 80s. I remember, parts of the Cold War. And so suddenly that's all just disappeared. There's no more threat over that. Now it's all Islamic terror. The whole thing has just shifted. And that suggests large-scale social engineering, right? That suggests things that the RAND Corporation themselves talk about and write about, that they would be involved in and have been involved in large-scale shifts in perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we've seen. So only something like the RAND Corporation and the Brookings Institute and these different big think tanks and NGOs, only something like that could take us out of a period where we're supposed to think that it's the Nazis, now it's the commies, now it's all the Islamic Jihad. And what you notice is that in every one of these new phases, there's no more so-called threat from the previous phase. Like, they're just gone. You know what I mean? It's like, did they all just convert overnight? Because we were supposed to think that they were just everywhere, right? I mean, the commies had infiltrated America. They're everywhere in America. And then suddenly, the Cold War's over. Now we got to worry about the sleeper cells of all the jihadists. Although, ironically, in the last few months, they have rehyped up the neoconservatives have rehyped the Cold War threat of the commies and the Russians. It's no longer the commies. It's just the Russians have infiltrated America and running the elections and all. Anyway, but yeah, this is all straight out of propaganda. If you remember the movie Red Dawn, It's really funny. It's a goofy movie, but you got Patrick Swayze and Charlie Sheen and a bunch of teenagers taking on like entire Soviet army, which is pretty funny. But that was an example of fear-based propaganda, out of the 80s.
Well, it's really one thing that's really interesting is that, well, first of all, I wanted to point out too when you were talking about Reagan and doing all this stuff with media propaganda, is that I remember reading that his eyesight was so bad that he was drafted in World War II, but he couldn't serve. So, in combat. So he was put into the movies. That was, so he was part of this. So he was well acquainted with how Hollywood and the propaganda machine worked in that era, and of course further on. The other thing that I think is quite fascinating is that it was something you brought up in one of your interviews where you were talking about morality, and Plato recognized that the power of the theater. And he felt that you should not show things that debase the society. But then we see now that, well, would you say Hollywood now is either intentionally or unintentionally shifting the values base to more of an amoral society?
Oh, I would say it's intentional, but I think it's more of it's also a symbiotic relationship. So it's not necessarily that every single director and producer is sitting there saying we've got to have transgender everywhere. It's rather that you'll have it promoted by certain interests or entities who are funded to do that for that purpose. It then kind of becomes edgy in the culture. Oh, this is a new civil right. This is a new leftist pseudo cause or something like that. And then it kind of takes on this life of its own. Oh, and then it starts to be promoted by other big foundations and entities, and corporate money goes into it. And so it's both of those things. It's something that infects the culture, and then the so-called arts, quote unquote, reflect it, and then it's reflected back into the culture, and then it gets worse and worse and worse, and it degrades. So. But yes, there is also the component of the intentional toxification of the culture. And this is what many of the guys out of the Frankfurt School talked about. This is what many of the CIA people who were involved in culture creation talked about openly, feminism, Gloria Steinem. You get all these people in the so-called arts like Jackson Pollock and Andy Warhol, who had some affiliation and support from the CIA. So, yes, they were actually literally studying the effects of abstract and degrading art on people, and that has come out publicly. It's not a conspiracy theory anymore. We know that's what the CIA was supporting. And then when we look into things like the Tavistock Institute and Bertrand Russell and when you look at the guys from the Frankfurt School and what they write, and I'm speaking of like Habermas and Horkheimer and Adorno, they'll talk about ways to destroy and deconstruct the arts. And you have Jacques Derrida doing this in literature, and you have these other characters doing it in the fields of visual arts and music and so forth, and creating very dissonant music, which is a lot of what we hear nowadays. So you put the stuff out there as kind of like what's avant-garde, right? That's how it happens. It's not like CIA guys are directing every weirdo who's trying to make something avant-garde. It's just that you put something out there by certain select people, and then the establishment or the media will pick that up and say, this is the genius, new, edgy, avant-garde art, right? And they do that because that's where they get their money, right, from these foundations, from CIA and so forth. And so then that infects the culture, right? Because the culture has been told, oh, you see, this is the new avant-garde, edgy, brilliant art. And if you may think that it's just a pile of vomit. You may think it's just a big pile of dung on a canvas. But no, you don't understand. You see, you aren't initiated into how to understand, that a big vat of piss or something like that is just brilliant art. You just don't get it. So, yeah, it's all based around this sort of pseudo-mysticism and pseudo-initiation. Quite literally, by the way, if you've ever been around the people who, do art shows and are kind of in the trendy, metropolitan areas, and which I've been around these people. And, one of my ex-girlfriends, her sister was one of these big, she got her master's in like studio art from Vanderbilt, and she would do these shows, and she would build these giant, like, vaginas, and she'd build giant wombs, and they're full of nails, and all, and it's like a giant, supposed to be a coffin. It's like, oh, this is so deep. What is the meaning of this? Oh, well, it's because I hate my, femininity. I don't want to ever have babies, and so I'm building this giant womb that's supposed to be, Anyway, I'm rambling, but you get the point. Is that it's not. It's all self-destructive, and it's toxic, and it hides under this guise of pseudo mysticism, and it's so deep, and it's absolutely intentionally promoted from up high.
Well, it reminds me that Sigmund Freud believed that everyone has these deep, dark things in their subconscious, but that you have to repress them, or else the society would crumble. And then one of his students, I'm sure you're acquainted with, Wilhelm Reich, and Reich believed that the way you could change the society would be to change, to bring all these deep, dark things out in the open, and then the society would adopt those, and then it would crumble and then be rebuilt into this socialist utopian paradise as he saw it.
Yep.
You see this as one of the reasons why maybe there is this kind of negativity towards tradition and family and religion?
Oh, absolutely. All those psychoanalysis and Frankfurt School guys all wrote about it. The authoritarian personality, they would write these books about how, the family was the source of, quote, fascism. And then when you look at what they try to explain fascism as, it's basically anything healthy. So if you want to, have a wife and have kids and that kind of stuff, oh, you're a fascist, that's fascism. And this is where we get the idea of authority in the social sphere, right? It comes out of this idea of patriarchal authority in the family. And so, yes, they literally have a view of utilizing weaponized culture, weaponized toxic ideas, ideologies to basically disintegrate, disrupt, destroy, and break down existing structures. And they do it by design. And I think that, rather than the older methods of the sort of the brutal, tyrannical regime, the iron fist of Stalin or something like that, what's a lot more effective, according to the guys who came out of Fabian socialism and as we said, the Frankfurt School, their idea was more in line with the incremental gradualist methodology, and that's a lot more effective. It's a lot more effective to toxify children's minds through cartoons and children's programming than it is to try to create some, gulag. You have the Disney gulag. That's a lot more effective in the long run than, the 1984 style top-down fist of Big Brother.
Well,
even though we do have elements of the Big Brother system as well, but yeah, the erosion of what's natural, the erosion of existing structures and hierarchies is absolutely part of the plan, and that's why a lot of times I talk about psychological warfare and those tactics, because when you study psychological warfare and military approaches to these things, you start to understand that, this is actually military warfare. Because what a military might do to an opposing force or power is that they're not just going to engage in outright warfare out on the field with your troops marching around in red suits with rifles or something like that. They're also going to engage in sanctions, which is economic warfare. They're also going to engage in psyops, which would be things like, maybe we're going to start to spread rumors about the king, over in this other country, or the president over in this other country. We might, the oldest version of this would be like poisoning the well. Mm-hmm. If somebody else is a well, you're damaging that population, and thereby you're reducing their ability to have young males who are able to fight in warfare, or guys who are able to continue the society through procreation.
Well, yeah.
So these are basic principles of warfare, and we just tend to think that that doesn't happen anymore. We live in America or something like that. But no, actually, we are the target of all of this same kind of warfare.
Mm-hmm. And I would note that a lot of people think that this kind of stuff, it sounds very theoretical, but at the same time, you can look up, if you just look up Brazil /soap operas /population control, people could find that the reason given for the really rapid reduction in the birth rate in countries like Brazil and Mexico, which, you're old enough to remember when, you think of a Mexican family, it was like 7, 8, 9 kids. Nowadays, it's more like 2. And the reason given is that the people that were writing and producing the soap operas intentionally put things into many of these, soap operas that showed only small families, that showed people delaying marriage. You create a character who he's the one who wants his wife to have a third child, but you make him very nasty and mean so the audience will hate him. And that's very effective. It's much more effective than telling a strongly Catholic population, no, you should use birth control because it's saving the world or something like that. Because they're going to think, no, I'm going to listen to the Pope. But if you constantly show them these dramas with that message, then the people start incorporating it subconsciously.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's all part of the agenda to degrade everything, and that's what you can't do that and expect that it doesn't come back on you. I'm sure everybody's heard of Edward Bernays' book on propaganda, but there's also another book that's almost as good or important by Jacques Ellul called Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes. And both he and Bernays say in their propaganda books that Hollywood and the cinema is the most powerful tool of propaganda in the world, in the modern world. Even more so than music, even more so than, you could just argue that the music industry is just another arm of this same beast, but yeah, that's why, when the U.S. military, for example, when they invade other countries, or when we go set up shop elsewhere, they'll set up psyops outfits that are there to create pop culture to inject into the host population, I guess you could say. So, in comes pornography, in comes all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I've talked to people from the Middle East who will actually say that this is true, that in Iraq now it's like modern entertainment. You mentioned the porn industry, and Hollywood and the porn industry seem to be kind of, the cousins that don't talk about each other, but yet they still benefit from one another.
I've not really delved into the history of porn, but I have heard people say this. And that would seem to make sense because, it's people. If people are going, I guess now that the internet is around, you don't really have to go to some place to be a porn star. I don't know, but I guess that for a long time it was. I guess out in L.A. or Hollywood, it was also the porn capital, I assume.
Well, where do the young starlets that just don't make it or they don't get enough work? Where do they go in order? I mean, they.
Well, they go into porn.
Yeah.
I talk about that in the book because that's actually the plot of a couple David Lynch movies. So he's actually saying that in the films. He's saying the girls that didn't make it to that they're still gonna pay their rent. So how are you gonna pay your rent as you're trying to become Greta Garbo or whatever? Well, I guess you're going to have to do whatever it takes.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting how we have this facade of the glamour and that sort of thing. I guess in a way, Hollywood's like Vegas. You go to Vegas at night, it's all flashy and bigger than life, and then during the daytime, it looks really ew. You don't want to go out on the strip in the daytime. So. But they tell us.
That's a good analogy. It's like Chris Hedges talks about in his book Empire of Illusion. He talks about Vegas as like a giant simulacra. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard has written of American culture, and sort of these big copies, these big these big plastic cities like Vegas that are they're like copies of everything else. They have giant pyramids, and they have a whole resort that's Roman themed, and it's very bizarre. But it's like the adult version of Disneyland, and that's kind of why I was interested in this newer series, Westworld. Not because I thought it was that great per se, but the theme that I talk about in terms of predictive programming is this idea of fiction kind of revealing things ahead of time for various means. Might be for social engineering, for conditioning, or whatever. But Michael Crichton, he wrote a long time ago Westworld and then Future World, and these are these ideas of the whole society being structured around fantasy worlds. And I'm starting to think that that's where we're going, because that's a much better way to control people, as we said, than the 1984 model. Mm-hmm. And that meshes a little better with like Brave New World than with 1984, because think about Disneyland, and I mean, it's almost kind of like a city-state of its own. Hollywood is kind of that way. Vegas is kind of that way. And so, I kind of think that where we're going is they're going to, like, what was it? Disney acquired Marvel. So now if you go to Disneyland, the whole Marvel characters are all there. So I think this centralization and these giant conglomerates, we're probably, I'm just speculating here, but there will probably be one day an entire state that will be like a fictional land that you'll go to, and then eventually, because of increased poverty, it'll be like only the elites are going to these places because or maybe the elites will live in the Disney castle, and then everybody else will be like the servants, and there will be the robots and the bots. You'll be bots will be serving people out of Epcot or something.
Well, two of the there's three big movies, right? I mean, three big series that people seem to talk about. That proverbial around the water cooler type thing. And that seems to be Game of Thrones, Walking Dead, and now Westworld.
Right.
And it seems that Game of Thrones is almost like teaching everyone psychopathy is the way to go. That's the way leadership should be. Walking Dead, maybe. Well, if we keep poking Russia, that's going to be our next life. But then Westworld gives the other option of this technological utopia.
The fantasy world, right? I think the key thing about Westworld is this idea, not just of transhumanism, but also that man, the best way to control man is through his imagination. And I think that what we're going to see with VR, virtual reality, and all this kind of stuff, Matrixy type stuff, right? I mean, this is where we're going, where people are going to just enmesh themselves in virtual fantasy worlds, and they may become real in a sense, insofar as there may eventually be giant theme parks that will surpass anything that we've thought of, like Vegas or Disneyland. But anyway, that's just all speculation. But so many times you do see in fiction and science fiction, this predictive, prophetic almost element where they're telling us where we're going, and if that's because Philip K. Dick knew all of his stuff because he was in the circles of Silicon Valley is probably the case, or whether it's just artistic inspiration. Could be both. Regardless, there is this phenomenon that's just very fascinating, and that's what I try to cover in several sections of the book is, fiction telling us ahead of time what's going on. And I mentioned, for example, Minority Report in the book, and Minority Report tells us about pre-crime, right? Which this is just this idea of, we're going to use AI algorithms and so forth, and we're going to tell you ahead of time where crimes are going to be, which sounds like a giant scam, of course, but that's at least, whatever it is, that's at least what's being implemented now in certain cities. And you have the CEO of IBM doing a whole lecture talking about how that's what's going to be the norm in the smart city. So we have smart houses are coming on the market now. We're going to have smart cities, and the norm is going to be, that everything's going to be tracked and traced to the extent that there will be supposed pre-crime. So,
well,
all of this, again, has been told to us in fiction, and this is why fiction is important from the analysis perspective, right? I mean, I'm not saying you can't enjoy fiction or science fiction. I do. I think it's enjoyable at times. And even when you can recognize the propaganda, you can still enjoy the aesthetic elements of it at times. But that's what's unfortunate about government and intelligence agency, fingers in the arts and control of the arts and corporate control of the arts, is that it really over time it just degrades it. It just becomes a thing where if you set aside the propaganda elements and set aside the esoteric or occult elements, it's basically just copycats. Like, how many movies are we going to have that are a remake of something from the 80s? That's all they do now is these remakes. And they're even remaking movies that were new 10 years ago. There was just a Spider-Man that was a remake of Spider-Man, and now there's a new Spider-Man. So they just, how many times are they going to remake King Kong? You know what I mean?
Yeah. But it is a fascinating concept. Now, we're almost out of time here. Where can people find your book and also find your website? Because you have some really interesting stuff there.
There's over 1,000 posts at jaysanalysis.com. I think about 90-95% of it's my own material. And there's 120 film analyses, film reviews. A lot of what's there at the site is different than what's in the book. So if you want the cream of the crop, you're going to have to get the book, which is, there's a tab there at jaysanalysis.com where you can get a signed copy. So I always ask that people please get it from me and not through Amazon, because, it might be a little bit more from me, but authors do a lot better when you get it directly from them. So you can get a signed copy from me, and it's done very well. It's only been out for 3 or 4 months, and I've got, I think, across markets, across Goodreads and Amazon, UK and US, I think I've got 65 stars within 4 months, which is pretty good. A lot of books, it takes a long time for them to get to that, but so that's 90-95% positive reviews, and you can get, if you're outside the U.S., you can also get it. There's a PayPal tab for that as well, but there's also a subscription service I offer where I do podcast talks, lectures, interviews, and so forth at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. So there's a treasure trove there that you can dive into.
Okay. Excellent. Well, I hope people will do that. And that pretty much brings us up to the end here. Thank you very much for being on the show. Very, very interesting materials.
Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, you take care now and be working on that. You said you're going to work on a sequel, right?
Well, actually, 2 or 3. There's enough material already written for 2 or 3 more books, but I think it's just going to depend on how well it's already doing well enough that I think I can confidently say there will probably be a sequel, but we'll give it a little more time. time and see how well it does and go from there. But yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, great. Well, good luck on that. And again, listening audience, check out his site and become more informed about how the elite are trying to manipulate you and your children 24/7. Now, what I would like to go into, what I think is the trend with our money. Now, in my latest book, that's The Destiny of Our Past, okay, it's a science fiction thriller set during the era of Noah, approximately 12,000 years ago. And in it, money is not something the people handle anymore because they have microchips, and whenever they need to purchase something or whenever they need to go into a building that has a security clearance, the only thing they have to do is, wave their arm across the scanner, and that will take care of any transaction or identification. And I personally think that's the direction we're going. Thus, the reason why the book is called The Destiny of Our Past, because ultimately it's more of a reflection on where we're going in society today. So anyway, moving on here to what I would consider the advantages and disadvantages to a cashless society. Remember, I don't mean that you work for free, okay? Money would just go directly to your account. I mean, there's countries like, the countries in Scandinavia, they don't even use checks hardly at all. Everything's done via the computer to pay off bills. And most people, when they go to the supermarket to buy something, or to the mall or whatever, they use a debit card or credit card or whatever. Most people don't actually handle cash anymore, and I think these guys are the trendsetters, and I don't necessarily mean that in a good way. All right, and I'll explain. But first, I'm going to deal with, remember, the advantages that will be used to promote this cashless society. Doesn't mean I support it. I'm just going to go through the advantages, and then I'm going to come up with the ideas as to why it would not be a good idea to eliminate cash. Remember, this is not something, this is not just something that is sci-fi in this sense, because this is, the top economists and planners are talking this way right now. So anyway, first of all would be convenience. Now, I mentioned the thing about the microchip. Just think how convenient that would be. Heck, you could go into a store and, those feelings you get when sometimes you forget your wallet or you took the wrong card with you, that sort of thing. Well, the convenience, if we did have the microchipping that would have to, I believe, eventually go in order to have this cashless society, well, the convenience would be you could actually directly load items into your purse or a bag or car or whatever. Whatever you want to put the items in. And then you would walk out without going through a cashier. Okay, now that'd be very convenient in that sense. No cashier. And you wouldn't have that problem of, just taking all your stuff out and showing it. You'd walk through a screen, and it would just automatically take the money out of your account. Heck, you could put the code on that you're trying on at a store and wear it out as long as you leave the little microchip in. By the way, many clothes nowadays actually have a microchip built in. And so, this would not take that much modification. So, essentially, you have a microchip, your clothes, your items you're buying all has microchips. And another advantage or convenience in this sense is that it would register all the stuff that you've bought. And that would mean that advertising would be aimed directly at you without getting a lot of clutter from things that just aren't part of your demographic. For instance, maybe you're 70 years old and you don't really like to see ads for baby food or something like that. It would advertise things aimed at you instead when you get things in your mails or social media and so forth. Now, the other thing is it could decrease crime, since it would be very difficult to launder money anymore. Your crime rate would go down considerably. You would people would not be able to have like these scenes you see in movies where the guy at the crack house has this big pile of $100 bills on the table, okay? Because it would be so easy to track after that. So therefore, the government could crack down on the illicit use of crime. Well, I was going to get to the downside of that in just a moment, but let me just go on here. So, crime control. And like I said, you'd have this microchip, and maybe it would have all of your information on it, so that if you get hurt, you go to the hospital, they know what conditions you have. I mean, it's just such a utopian premise, isn't it? I mean, convenience, less crime, you get the microchip. That means you don't have to worry about losing your keys. Everything's just wonderful. Now let's get to the downside. I said the thing about crime. Now, one thing that this would really, really prevent, and I think that's one of the reasons why governments would like to get into this, is, and it's not really a crime per se, but it is the underground market. And that is a sense of people who barter with each other for items, people who work off the clock. Like you got a guy who's a plumber and he gets called at 2 a.m, and you have an arrangement made where maybe he goes ahead and you pay him cash, and then he doesn't put it down, and therefore there's no taxes taken out of it. Just things like your roadside garage sales even would be very difficult without some sort of cash, because maybe you don't have all of the fancy technology and hardware in order to do these kinds of transactions yourself. You don't have something to read someone's chip and so forth. This could be a problem in the sense that people do like that little bit of liberty that they could buy and sell things on the side. And if it's just a minor thing, they may not want to report it to the government. And, there are people that would say that's a good thing. But then if you're just talking about someone selling some, extra tomatoes they grew in their garden, or a kid picking some apples or making lemonade and selling it at a stand, that would become more difficult in such a society. And again, we see all these videos from America where kids set up lemonade stands and the cops come and crack down on them. Well, the laws aren't different. They're just applied differently now than they were when people had a little common sense 30 years ago, or 40 years ago especially. And so this would really crack down on that, because it'd make it impossible to do those kinds of small microeconomic transactions. Now, another disadvantage is that if you think about it, you could have a situation where your funds could be cut off. Let's say you've run afoul of the government or something, and they decide that they're going to come after you. So a good way to bring you in, and remember, this could be when we have a more dystopian style government, would just be to shut off your chip. And then, in this cashless society, how are you going to live? It's going to be very difficult to be able to access any reserves that you might have. Now, on the other hand, something that I just mentioned as a positive thing, the thing about being able to market to you, could be very negative in the sense that all of your purchases, all of your finances, your preferences in everything, if you paid money for it, is now recorded. So you can't go in and, you know the wife doesn't like it if you drink whiskey or something. You can't go in there and pay with cash at the local liquor store and, use it while on a trip or something like that up to the mountains with your friends. By the way, I don't do that. I don't drink alcohol. But I'm just saying this as an example. And the interesting thing would be then that if you use your card, she could see it. But if everything's cashless and there's a record sent of all transactions, then not just to the government, but also your wife sees what you've been purchasing. So that could be a problem. And again, some people would be like, oh, that's a good thing. But is it really? Do you want the government to micromanage you in that kind of sense? And then also the corporations also knowing so much about you that they could set up a psychometric profile and be able to tell more about you than you might even know? Heck, why go to a psychotherapist? You could just go to a marketer and say, look over my data and tell me what I need to do to have a happier life. Seriously, I'm not joking. This is something that you should consider when you read these stories about the cashless society. Now, again, where it really gets down to how much you trust the government and how much you trust, institutions, large institutions. If you think the government is there for you and all the men and women who serve in government are doing so out of some sort of civic duty and honor, then you're going to think, yes, I can trust them. Why not do this? Of course, if you're one of those people that read things like the Bible or a little bit of history of government in the last 200 years, you may not be so trusting. So I think ultimately this is why you see a situation where this idea of microchipping and the cashless society has taken off more in Scandinavia than it would necessarily be popular in much of the United States. Because Scandinavians tend to have a sense of trust within them. And they tend to trust their institutions more than, for instance, Americans and Brits and French, because there's different histories, different experiences, so many differences. But ultimately, you get down to the idea that if you feel that government is, for instance, John Locke's idea that government is kind of a necessary evil that has to be there in order to kind of be the referee in the society, you're not going to necessarily like giving this kind of power over to it. But when you have all the financial institutions who are thinking this would be fantastic, it makes their jobs easier, you'd eliminate even more jobs in regards to banking, and you'd have more connection to what people do financially, then you're going to see more of this promoted. And maybe in America you may have a little bit less desire for it because of the high level of religiosity within the population, and therefore the whole thing about the mark of the beast. I'm including that in my next book, by the way. But I think ultimately you're at least going to see this pushed and promoted and marketed to people all over the world, including the United States. And whereas I think there will be people that will hold out, I think a lot of people just like, oh, it's so much more convenient. It's so, and they'll accept it, even with all the dangers involved.
is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.